Okay, welcome everybody to the 105th Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar Series. We have Alex Cardazzi, who as of about 10 days from now will be at Old Dominion University in the US, and currently probably officially affiliated to West Virginia University, as he is on the poster for this particular talk. Before he takes away his presentation, just a quick administrative notice again. As last week, I am starting to fill up the autumn or the fall schedule for the Roses talks, and so if you do want to present or you know someone else who might want to present some kind of work related to sport or economics, well, sport and economics, please do feel free to get in touch. I will put a doodle poll in the chat and you can stick in availability there for the weeks between September 16th through to about December the 12th or something. So please do have a look at that. And we'll also, as I've mentioned before, and I'll put the information again, we have the second Reading Football Economics workshop in December to coincide with the World Cup, the football or soccer World Cup semi-finals. And as I put on the website for that, we interpret both economics and football liberally. So if your football is of a different type to what's behind me on my background picture, that is acceptable and has been acceptable in previous periods of the conference. So I'll put information in the chat. If you're not able to see the chat, drop me an email if you want any more information about those events. I'm not going to take up any more of Alex's time. Alex is presenting a paper blaming the referee, or blaming the ref, understanding the effect of unexpected emotional cues on family violence. Alex, please do take away your talk.
All right. I'm going to do a screen share here. So hopefully you guys can see this.
Yep.
So
your camera's turned off though, Alex. I don't know if well, it might turn off for me and not for everyone else. But
well, it's telling me I can't share, so you're gonna have to do without my face. I apologize. So this paper, I was actually just mentioning right before we started, was just recently published in the Journal of Law, Economics, and Organization. And through that, it's changed a little bit since the original working paper draft, including the title. So now the title is Emotional Cues and Violent Behavior, Unexpected Basketball Losses Increase Incidence of Family Violence. This is joint work with Professors Brian McCannon and Brad Humphreys, and then Zach Rodriguez, who was a grad student with me at WVU when we started this project, but now we both have jobs, so different affiliations. So I'll start the talk by talking about emotional cues. The way we use emotional cues generally in economics stems from behavioral economics. It's essentially saying that decision-making is driven by factors outside of what we typically or classically define as rationality. Typically, it has to do with loss aversion or reference dependence. So the idea of loss aversion, as I'm sure many of you are familiar, is that the pains of a loss are felt more than the benefits of a gain. In other words, for a concrete example, it's worse to lose $20 than it is to gain $20. If you think about this as like a rational robot, this should not be the case, but because we're human, it is the case. This also has to do with reference dependence. So agents are evaluating outcomes in reference to some anchoring point. In other words, if you go to a casino expecting to make money, but you actually lose money, you'll be very, very upset. But if you kind of go there with the expectation of losing money and you do lose money, then you won't be so upset. So even though the outcomes are the same, it's that expectation or that reference point that's going to be driving that utility in general. So there's been a huge explosion of literature in the past 5-6 years or so, looking at unexpected sporting outcomes. So for example, there's a paper that shows increased tipping in taxi cabs after unexpected wins for the New York Knicks, reduced voter turnout after competitive Monday night NFL games. There's this one paper about harsher judicial sentencing after upset losses of NCAA football games. So, judges will sentence criminals to worse sentences if LSU specifically loses unexpectedly. So there's been a huge literature on this, but it all pretty much stemmed from this Cardazzi 2011 paper. in which they show that upset losses in the NFL, National Football League, generate additional domestic violence in the home cities that experience the upset loss. So our research question is going to be, does this result that Cardazzi found in 2011 replicate in a different league of a less violent sport 10 years into the future? So there's a couple different variations here, like basketball is less violent generally than American football. In addition, this is later on in human history. Hopefully there's just been less domestic violence over time, and stuff like this. So this is going to be our research question, and we're going to try to approach it using a very, very similar methodology as Cardazzi. So our data sources are going to be the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS. We're going to look at male on female at-home violence between boyfriend, girlfriends, spouses. There's a few other designations in terms of relationship, but this is kind of the general idea. We're doing this really, really specific identification because that's what Cardazzi do. And we just want to make sure that we're sticking as close to their paper as possible. We're also going to get data from the NBA, the National Basketball Association. This is going to give us game level information, for example, who's playing, where they're playing, all sorts of stuff about the score, things like this. And we're going to get referee level information. So I'm going to pause on that and talk about this last 2-minute report. So the NBA releases these last 2-minute reports where they grade their referees during the last 2 minutes of close games. So essentially what they do is in the last 2 minutes, when the game is within about 3 to 5 points, they will tell for each material play that could possibly impact the game, they will say whether the call made was a correct call or incorrect call. But they'll also say if it was a correct no call or an incorrect no call. So essentially we have these type 1 and type 2 errors, and we're able to observe all of them. This was kind of the crux of the paper originally and why we named it Blaming the Ref. But through the revision process, this portion of the paper has been weeded out. So the way I'm going to present this is I'm going to present this paper, and then I'm going to have a little section at the end where we kind of look more for future research at this last 2-minute reports. So I'd be really interested in hearing people's thoughts and feedback on that stuff. So if you have any, I'm happy to talk about it. So that's why we're going to get referee level information from the NBA. So we're able to look at things like referee fatigue or referee distance that they've traveled, or just use referee fixed effects, things like this. Finally, we're going to get sportsbook review. It's a betting data website. We're going to get the betting spread, which is essentially the expectation of the difference in the two scores. So I think I can visualize this a little bit better than explaining it, but using the betting data is how we're going to identify game expectations. So I'll talk about that more in 1 second, but here's just a quick table of the 8 counties that have NBA teams and report data to NIBRS, that National Incident-Based Reporting System. So you can see here we have 8 different teams all across the country, very different demographics. But one thing I'll note is that NIBRS data is at the agency level. And for example, Cuyahoga is where Cleveland is, the Cavaliers. And we have an average of about 5 domestic violence incidents as defined by Cardazzi every day over the course of our sample. Whereas in Harris, Texas, where Houston is, which is the 3rd largest city in America, we have much, much less, 0.05. So this is not to say that Harris, Texas has a 100th of what Cleveland has, but rather it's just the number of agencies, how they're reporting it, and stuff like this. So as long as so the assumption we're making in this using this data is that there's not going to be a significant difference in the way they're reporting and the number of agencies that are reporting. So it's not going to be like more agencies are coming in over time. And more explicitly, we actually make sure that the agencies we're looking at within our sample are reporting throughout the entire time period. So even though these numbers look like Cleveland is the worst place to be if you're a woman in a relationship versus Texas. This is not necessarily the case. This is just a function of the data. So here's a kind of a famous plot from Card and Dahl where they look at the point spread on the x-axis, so the expectation, and then the actual score differential on the y-axis. So you can see that if the point spread is negative, that essentially means that the home team is favored. If the point spread is positive, that means that the away team is favored. So if we look here, I'm going to use my mouse here, hopefully you guys can see that. If you have a point spread of -14, it means that the home team is expected to win by 14 points. And you can see on average, it sort of works. The expectation is going, the actual game outcome is going to be about 14. So the way that Card and Dahl are going to do this is, okay, if you're expected to win, you're going to have a negative point spread. But if the score differential is positive, it means that the away team actually won. So this corner right here is going to be all the upset losses. So these are where they're getting all of their action from. So we replicated their plot using NBA data, and we generate the same exact sort of outcomes where we have our point spread on the x-axis, our score difference on the y-axis, and we're designating things as predicted win, predicted close, and predicted loss. So I want to be explicit about how we're defining these things. Card and Dahl, I'm going to go back one slide. Card and Dahl just use about 4 points. If you're 4 points or more on either side, that's going to designate if you're predicted to win or predicted to lose. Now for the NFL, this makes sense because one field goal is 3 points, and it's kind of a big deal to march down the field, kick a field goal. A 3-point swing is significant. However, in basketball, a 3-point shot can happen in 10 seconds. So the swings are much more variable. So the way we define our predicted win, predicted close, and predicted loss is we just divide up the data in 3 sections. So we just do it in terciles. So we have 1/3 of the data are going to be predicted wins, 1/3 of the data are going to be predicted close, and then 1/3 of the data are going to be predicted loss. Now we are deviating from the literature. For example, all of that other literature, or nearly all that other literature, uses the same exact point spread as Card and Dahl, even if they're looking at basketball. So we do test the sensitivity of our result to varying these definitions. So specifically what we'll do is we'll move these lines out this way, which would create even larger unexpected losses because the games are becoming more of an expectation that the team wins because the point spread is getting more negative. And then we'll also move this in, which is kind of doing the reverse, making the upset losses a little bit less upsetting, for lack of a better term. So our empirical specification is essentially what we're going to do is we're going to compare days without NBA games to days with NBA games. However, those days with NBA games, we're going to break up into days where the game outcome is equal to the expectation and days where the game outcome does not equal the expectation. So in other words, we're going to have an indicator variable for expected loss, expected close, expected win, and then we're going to interact all of those variables with the opposite game outcome. So for expected loss, we're going to have a variable for expected loss and then expected loss times a win. So that's going to be able to give us the differential impact of when you're actually expecting to lose, but you do in fact win. Same thing with expected win. We're going to have actual loss and then an actual win. So specifically, here's our model that we estimate using a Poisson regression because domestic violence incidents are count variables. We have the expectation of a loss here with times alpha 1, and we have beta 1, which is the expectation of a loss times the win. So the differential impact of that shock in the expectation. And we're going to do this for each game type. And then we have controls that vary by county and time, such as if the game is nationally televised, attendance, all sorts of information like this. We're going to have team fixed effects, which you can think of as county fixed effects because it's only one county per team. We also have season fixed effects, not necessarily year fixed effects because the NBA season runs over the course of the year. Further, if we did year fixed effects, you can capture differences in team quality. For example, we have the Cleveland Cavaliers. Our sample goes from 2011 to 2018. If you're familiar with basketball, that's a time when LeBron James came to Cleveland, which significantly changed the outcomes and expectations of the team. So we're controlling for season. We're also able to control for month. And sometimes in every other regression, we'll control for team by season to really capture those differences amongst teams and seasons. And then once we estimate those outcomes, we're going to look at the heterogeneities and we're going to look at robustness. So we're going to estimate the effect by day of week. We're going to change those point spreads to change the definition of how we're defining expectations. We're going to look at referee correctness using those L2M reports, which again, we're going to talk a little bit about, but more at the end. We're going to proxy for game importance by how many weeks are remaining left in the season. So if there's a lot of weeks left, each game is probably less important than at the very end of the season, where the game is probably has higher stakes because you're fighting for playoff, or rather you're fighting for a good draft pick if you're tanking. We're going to look at the effect of unexpected losses on previous, like the week earlier domestic violence. If we find an effect there, that would be very strange. If an unexpected loss today increased domestic violence last week. So this is going to be a robustness check. And then we're also going to randomly assign upset losses throughout the calendar for each of these teams. We're going to randomize this 1,000 times, and then hopefully we get a distribution that is centered around 0, with 95% of the T statistics being within -2 and +2. And our effect is kind of way to the right and differentiated from these randomly assigned calendars. So here is our main result. So we have predicted loss times win. So this is going to be that diff and diff coefficient. We have predicted close times loss. For both of these on weekdays and weekends, we find no effect. For upset losses on weekdays, we also find no effect. But for weekends, we do find a strong and significant positive result. So this is actually pretty interesting because Card and Dahl look at the NFL, which is almost all of the games are played on Sundays. So there really isn't very much variation in day of week in their study, but because basketball is played throughout the week, we actually have this really neat feature of the data that we're able to look at effect by day of week. And here's that coefficient plot. So we have really no effect for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. There's a positive but highly variable effect for Thursdays, a negative but highly variable effect for Fridays, and then weekly significant results for Saturday and Sundays. But when they're aggregated, those standard errors are going to shrink a little bit. And essentially what we're finding is all of the action is happening at the end of the week. It's unclear why Friday is negative. Perhaps Fridays are special in that people have different things to distract them from an unexpected loss or something like this. Maybe they're able to blow off steam differently. It's a little bit unclear to us, but this is what the data show. Now we're gonna vary those point spread thresholds. So I tried to explain this earlier. I'm gonna revisit the identification plot. So what we're going to do is this line right here is defining our predicted wins. We're going to shift this line to the left, and we're going to shift this line to the right, and we're going to do the same thing with predicted losses. This is essentially going to get at, we would expect an upward sloping trend if we're increasing the line or pushing the line to the left. This loss had a much larger prediction than these ones here, so the effect should be greater for these ones. And then it should be smaller if we move those lines inwards. And that's pretty much what we find. So for weekdays, we find an upward slope, but generally insignificant. For weekends, we find that if we open up that point spread, as the upset losses get quote unquote worse or more upsetting, we get a stronger effect. And as we shrink those things together, we get a slightly weaker effect. This makes perfect sense. We want to be very open and clear about the sensitivity of our results. It seems like splitting the data in thirds gives a pretty median effect. And then, this is what would happen if we changed the way that we're going to define these things. So in other words, previous studies who maybe use that Cardinal 4 and 4 effect are maybe actually understating their effects. And maybe this should be something that they should look into to look at how their effects change by changing those definitions. So this is a regression that looks at the effect of referee fatigue, so the number of days off between games referee crews have, and their correctness as defined given the last 2-minute reports. So the issue with the last 2-minute reports is they only exist for half of our sample and in terms of time period, and for only the close games, and for the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter. So it's a little bit difficult to say to extend these results to every single game. So we just simply don't have a measure, but we do have a measure of days off between games because we can look at all the referees and how they're traveling. So we find here that the number of days off, if referee crews on average increase the number of days off that they have between games by 1, the number of correct calls will increase in the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter. The percent of correct calls will increase. And this is true if we use the mean or the median of the referee crew. We can't actually identify always which referee is making which call, but we can look at all the referees together and aggregate them as one unit. So we have this proxy that says, hey, as referees are more fatigued, they're more likely to be incorrect. So we can plug that into our regression, and we can interact it with upset losses. So when we do this, we find a positive and significant effect for upset losses. But as days off increases and referees are more rested and then more likely to be more correct, we find that this effect is reduced. So that's an interesting result because we're getting less and less of this increase in domestic violence if we simply just rest our referees. We wanted to make sure that there was nothing really fishy going on with this. So again, we cut our referee rest variable into thirds, and we estimate this using indicator variables instead of forcing a linear approximation through it. And we find, again, those upset losses are completely concentrated in the low rest upset losses. So referee fatigue and upset losses are both completely exogenous to domestic violence. The NBA is not planning what refs are going to referee what game and which games are going to be upset losses because of domestic violence. These are completely exogenous variables, and we're finding this effect is concentrated in that situation. We also look at game importance. So the first two columns, we have the previous result of upset losses and days off. And we also find that we have a negative effect for weeks remaining. So as the number of weeks remaining in the season increases, meaning that it's earlier on in the season, this effect is also mitigated. So that's also an important result that shows that, hey, maybe it's this thing where because the game is very, very important, that's what's, and there's an upset, then maybe that's what's driving that increase in domestic violence. But I'll pause for 1 second and show the next slide, and I'll come right back. So this is the regression where we look at the domestic violence in the previous week given an upset loss today, and we find no effect. So this makes perfect sense to us because it really shouldn't be the case that domestic abusers are anticipating upset losses in the future. So this is a pretty good sensitivity analysis or robustness check to show that these upset losses are not increasing domestic violence in the previous week. We also do this sort of regression for the days off regression and for the weeks remaining regression. When we do it for days off, we get 0 effects. There's no impact on the previous. There's no impact on the previous week's domestic violence when we're looking at the amount of rest that a referee has today. But there is this weird effect for upset losses and weeks remaining. So we don't really trust this result as much as we trust this one. So again, just wanted to be forthcoming with that this set of regressions fail this test. So now what we're going to do is we're going to randomly assign upset losses by team and season. So this is an example of February 2016. Essentially what we're doing is we're taking 3 upset losses that happened in February 2016, and we're just going to randomly assign them across the calendar. And we're going to do this 1,000 times. And each time we do this, we're going to estimate the model and grab the t-stat. So after we do this 1,000 times and we rerun our regression 1,000 times, this is the distribution of t-statistics where it's centered around 0. Most of them fall between -2 and +2. So this is some suggestive evidence that we're clustering our standard errors correctly. We're estimating these models correctly. And this red line right here is our effect. So we get an exact p-value, which is essentially saying if we take all of these t-statistics and look at the number of them that are larger than our effect divided by the total of 1,000, it's about 13 total regressions have t-stats larger. So that's a p-value of about like 0.01 or 0.001 or something like this. So again, that's pretty close to the actual p-value we get from our regression tables. So we're pretty confident in this result. So our conclusion for this paper, and please don't leave, we have a little bit more at the end, is that upset losses in the NBA lead to increased intimate partner violence. This is exactly replicating what Card and Dahl find 10 years later in a less violent sport. That said, Card and Dahl estimated an effect size of about 10% increase in domestic violence following an upset loss. We find about a 1.5% or so. So it is significantly smaller, but there's a couple things that might be driving that. For example, there's only 16 games in a typical NFL season, but there are 82 games in a typical NBA season. So there are a lot more opportunities for these upset losses. And if we look at the sum over the entire season, it could be the case that it's actually relatively similar. So our solution, which generally probably will not happen because of financial interests, but we can shorten the season. We can play less games. If we increase the rest between the games, referees will be more accurate and it will prevent this domestic violence as our models would suggest. It would also create less opportunity for upset losses to occur because there's physically less games. And there's also less player injury. There's a lot of research that shows that players who play back-to-backs or are playing heavy minute loads are more likely to get hurt. So this would kind of be a win-win for everybody except for the NBA itself and the owners, who would suffer financial implications due to less games. So I guess I'll pause here and ask if anybody has any questions, or we can hold them to the end. I'm not sure. What do you want to do, James?
Don't mind. Any questions? Jorge.
Hello.
Hello.
Really, I really like your paper, but I have one question about your conclusion, because you're saying that one thing that could be done is to shorten the season. But I believe, I'm not that expert in American sports, but I tend to sense that football fans are much more crazy, I guess, maybe because the season is shorter. And, in the NBA, because it is so long, you would think in principle that people are kind of more used to upset losses because you play so frequently that it's very difficult for your team to not have an upset loss at some point in the season. So I'm finding this kind of, contradictory in what would one expect from what's going on with the NFL and what you're saying is going on with the NBA.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think you're right about that. That because there's more games, the effect size is generally smaller. I think there's probably a correlation between that. So it's unclear if we look at like the sum of all the unexpected losses and the sum of the effects, if that would outweigh the impact of shortening the season and then having each game be more impactful. So that's a really fair point, and we really can't rule that out unless we have much variation in the NBA season, which There's only been a couple lockouts, and the bubble season was strange, so we probably don't want to look at that to test this. But yeah, it would be really interesting to look at maybe different leagues. But then again, you have the differences in the nature of the sport. American football is quite violent, so it could attract more violent viewers who are more prone to domestic violence. So there's a lot of factors going on that we can't really say. So this solution, again, I'm saying it just as one possible outcome, but we don't have perfect evidence for it. That's definitely the case. Thank you.
Just, a thought that springs to mind there is, could presumably, if the salience of the game matters, would you be able to look at the playoff games to kind of get a sense of what the effect might be on a more high-profile game on domestic violence?
Yeah, so we cut out playoff games. I'm trying to remember. It's been a while, but I think we included them and it was the same. But the issue with playoff games is because they're playing the same team like 7 times in a row, the outcomes are kind of the same in terms of this betting spread. There's a little bit of variation in it, but generally speaking, it's just like the same observation 7 times or 4 times or 5 times, how many times they play. So we wanted to kind of avoid that nuance and just look at the regular season. Makes sense.
Sebastian has a question as well.
Just a quick question, Alex. You said your solution would be, or suggestion is, to shorten the season. Wouldn't it be just easier to just hire more referees? I mean, isn't that just more cost efficient?
Yeah, so you could hire more referees, but the NBA is pretty selective with their referees in terms of quality. I'll talk a little bit more about this with the L2M stuff, but the NBA specifically, when they're doing playoff games, they select the quote unquote best referees to referee those games, and they're almost always like 20-year NBA referee veterans. So the quality of the actual referee might suffer, but it's unclear how much.
Yeah, exactly. And it shortens the season. I mean, you were losing millions, right? And just hiring a couple of referees, like, I don't know, 10, 20 more, that would change it. Okay. Good, thanks.
That's a good point. It's a good point.
Thanks, Sebastian. And then Stefan has a question.
Hi, Alex. I was with you all the way until the end when you got to that point, and now I'm just really scratching my head and making me think about all sorts of things. I think it's the suggestion that the implication of what you're suggesting there at the end is that if only we avoid provoking these domestic violence abusers by making the games more predictable, then we'll live in a better world. That I really object to this. So I think that, domestic violence is a very significant problem across all segments of society, regardless of whether people are sports fans or not. So first, I don't think you've any evidence to show that sports fans are any more likely to commit domestic violence than non-sports fans. I don't know if you have any evidence of that. I've not heard of that, but it seems quite implausible to me and more or less untestable. The other thing that strikes me is that this raises now in my mind, with a question I hadn't thought of before, is what's the evidence that there is more domestic violence surrounding sports events than when there's absence of sports events? And you just mentioned the idea of the lockout. Well, so let's look at those counties. Were there any fewer reports of domestic violence in those counties when there was no NBA, when the NBA wasn't playing? This is sort of like the classic sort of stadium argument. Stadiums, can generate visitors to cities or to countries. Well, yeah, maybe, but maybe they're just displacing visitors from one activity to from one time period to another, and maybe that's all this is doing. This is just evidence that violence is displaced from other days of the week to these particular events, or from other times to these particular events.
Yeah, you have a lot of good points there. And I think I'll address your first one about the implausibility of shortening the season. And I think I don't think I mean this as a solution that we should undertake, because I just don't think that the NBA or the players, because there's revenue sharing in that league, would be okay with this. But rather, if we were just trying to do the best thing for women and we were just trying to reduce this domestic violence effect, this would be one way to do it, because we find the effect is concentrated in these fatigued referees. So I think your point is well taken there.
No, but you can't even draw that inference. You don't have any evidence to say that overall there is less domestic violence when you don't have these close games. You're just saying when you have these close upset games, you have an increase in domestic violence. That doesn't. The alternative is not, well, there's less domestic violence if you don't have these games. It's just the domestic violence could be displaced to other times and places. Surely you've no evidence at all on this, right?
So we didn't test this explicitly, but Card and Dahl do look at other sorts of time periods of the day of the game, and they find that that domestic violence is pretty much zeroed out. So there's really no effect, positive or negative, until like after the game. So sure, it could be displaced across days. Like, for example, if there's an unexpected loss and there's an increase in domestic violence, maybe there's less the next day. Is that what you're insinuating?
No, what I'm saying is just take a county that doesn't have an NBA team, and presumably they're not interested in following it. Is there any are you implying that because the presence of the NBA team in one county means that on average its level of domestic violence is higher than in the county that doesn't have the NBA team, all else equal?
I think what I'm saying is that when there's unexpected losses, there's an increase in domestic violence. So because there are unexpected losses within that county, then sure, the average will be higher, but it's only during those time periods.
Well, okay, so I think so, right. No, but I'm saying take the annual average for domestic violence in the county with the NBA team or the county without the NBA team. Are you claiming that because of the presence of these upset losses, on average, controlling for other confounders, that the level of domestic violence is higher? Because I don't think, well, one thing, obviously, you don't have data on that because you're looking at these specific counties with the NBA teams, but it seems highly implausible to me to suggest that that would be true.
Well, as I mentioned before, with the NIBRS data don't give a representative picture of domestic violence generally, because they don't have every single county. For example, I think there's like 30% of agencies don't report at all. So that's why we only can look at 8 counties.
Let me put it another way. That domestic violence is not a consequence of, is not uniquely attributable to the NBA. It is a problem that predominantly aggressive men have, and it's not, and it's unconnected to, in that sense, whether there are sports or not is probably. There's certainly no evidence to say that sports in society makes that more prevalent or less prevalent, right? We don't have any evidence on that. If we got rid of all sports, would we have less domestic violence in your view? If we banned the NBA, would domestic violence decline in your opinion?
That is unclear.
And you have no evidence on it, right? So that's my point. Is you're wrong to claim. You can't really claim any overall effect on domestic levels of violence because we just don't have any evidence on that proposition one way or the other, right?
I still
go ahead.
May I say something? In fact, at least in Latin America, there is evidence that domestic violence went up a lot during the pandemic when there were no sports. Just basically people closed up. So, I guess Stefan's point
domestic violence is endemic in a lot of societies. It's an endemic problem, and it may be in some cases correlated with sports, but we don't have any generic view of saying, well, sports I mean, your argument, if you took your argument seriously, this would be a case for banning sports altogether, which might be a good argument. Maybe we should abolish sports and say, because sports promotes domestic violence, we should ban it. It should be illegal. That's the actual policy implication of what you're saying, I think. And but I don't believe it, because I don't believe that banning sports would eliminate domestic violence. And I don't think either of us have any evidence one way or the other of that.
I think that's a fair point. That I think aggregate levels are, there is substitution effects. People, if there's no sports, as someone else had said, that there's going to be a substitution to other activities. I think the pandemic is a little bit tricky to observe, because there are other dynamics going on with that. But I think the point that we're trying to make is that conditional on the city, unexpected losses are driving additional domestic violence incidences outside of reporting and stuff like this. So I think, like, for example, in Cleveland, when the Cavaliers are expected to win, but they actually lose, that's going to increase domestic violence relative to other days of the week, relative to no NBA game. Now, I don't think we should ban sports per se, because I think there's trade-offs there. And I think sports do provide some benefit in society, whether it's tangible or not, that I think likely outweighs this sort of effect. Because if it was that pronounced, I think policymakers would say, hey, we're noticing this thing and it's really, really bad, and we should figure out a way to stop this. So I think it's a marginal effect. And I don't think we should ban sports. So yeah, those are my
I might disagree with you on that, but the point is that you don't know relative to the total. The counterfactual is what would be the aggregate domestic violence in these counties if the NBA didn't exist, to which we don't have the answer, right? We don't know that.
Maybe we could talk about this at the end, because I wanted to get to some more stuff about the last 2-minute report. But does anyone else have any burning questions before I move on? And thank you for those comments, Stefan. It was helpful to hear. All right, so I'm gonna move on, because there is some future research that we're trying to get some comments on. We're gonna use these last 2-minute reports a little bit more explicitly. So again, I'll kind of give a quick policy summary of what the L2M, or last 2-minute reports, really are. So the NBA had this, a lot of fans were complaining that referees were messing up the games and stuff like this. So the NBA decided to grade their referees during the crucial last minutes of close games. So in March 2015, the NBA implemented the first version of the last 2-minute report. Games that were graded had to be within 5 points at exactly 2 minutes. So if it was within 6 points at 2 minutes, and then someone at 1:59 hit a layup and it goes within 4 points, this does not qualify. It had to be at precisely 2 minutes. I think the NBA decided that this was a little bit of a weird definition. So in October 2017, they changed the definition of what constitutes an L2M report, or what would generate an L2M report. And they said you have to be within 3 points at any point within 2 minutes. So again, if you're within 6 points, someone hits at 2 minutes, and then someone hits a layup, or 2 layups, I guess, to make it within 4 points, or rather 2 points, that would trigger a L2M report, and that entire 2-minute period would be evaluated. So over the entire sample period from the end of 2011 until the middle of 2018, there are about 9,000 games, half of which were eligible for an L2M game. But obviously only some of them were close enough to have that triggered. So because of these different definitions, there are games that qualify for the first version and not the second, and vice versa. So we're actually just not going to look at these games, because it's a little bit difficult to identify the policies separately, because there's so few games that identify as just version 2 or just version 1. So we're really only going to look at these 2,700 games that didn't qualify for either of these, and then the close games that qualify for both version 1 and version 2. We're going to look at these games in the post period and in the pre-period. So we have kind of a counterfactual game in 2014 before the policy started, and then in 2016 after the policy was started, and then those games are going to be just as close, and the NBA or the referees are being graded then. So here's an example of a last 2-minute report. This is the very first one, the Pelicans at the Nuggets. It gives you the period, it gives you the time, it gives you the call type. So for example, this first one is a shooting foul. It gives you a committing player, a disadvantaged player, a review decision. So again, these just also happen to be correct calls, but it can be correct call, correct no call, and incorrect no call. The NBA provides a comment and a video. So the comment kind of gives you a little bit of text for the basis of why they are using this specific instance. And then they give you a video so you can watch the play and make the decision for yourself. So here's a little bit of a breakdown. I'll go back for 1 second. We have all these fouls here, stoppage. Here are all of the main categories. And we can look at what percent of them are correct calls, what percent of them are correct no calls. Fouls pretty much dominate the L2M report, and most of them are correct no calls. I think this is a little bit fishy because especially over time, we see more and more correct no calls, but correct no calls can be kind of every single second of every single game because the referee is not blowing the whistle and they're correct for not doing so because there is no infraction. So that's a little bit strange, but we find that fouls are the most prominent instance within L2M reports. The next one I think is very interesting is instant replay. So if a referee makes a call and there's some debate about it within the group, they will go to an instant replay monitor and they will decide that call via the instant replay monitor. The NBA considers both the original call and the instant replay as separate instances. So instant replays are almost always correct calls because they have video and the NBA is considering those to be quote unquote correct. But if we kind of look at the breakdown of instant replays, there's two categories: overturn ruling and support ruling. An overturn ruling is saying, hey, that previous call was actually incorrect. And then the support ruling would be, hey, that previous call was indeed correct. And if you look at this case, as the ratio of overturn calls to support calls, it's about 25% overturning. Whereas the NBA reports that their referees are over 90% correct, but this instant replay for these specific instances would say actually they're only about 75% correct. So our research questions are going to be two main ones that we have right now, but I'm happy to hear other ones if people are curious. The first one is going to be, do referees whistle more when they're observed? Do they change their behavior? So we can look at this at the game level as well as the shot level. I only have results for the game level for today, but we're working on looking at observation at the shot level to see what sort of factors when the shot is being taken, maybe decide whether or not the referee is going to blow the whistle. And then what explains referee correctness? Is it fatigue like we saw before? Is it previous correctness? Is it the effect of previous feedback measured through previous L2M reports that the referee was part of? What's the effect of immediate feedback, meaning these instant replays? If a referee is immediately told that they're wrong in the last call, are they more likely to be wrong in the future, or are they more likely to be correct in the future? So this first regression here is we're going to look at the effect of L2M grading on the number of whistles in the last 2 minutes of all games, fourth quarters at least. And we find that when the game is close, meaning it qualifies for an L2M report, after the policy is implemented, we find a slight reduction in the number of whistles. So about 0.2 less whistles, or about 7% less whistles. So we find that once the referees are being observed and they know that they're going to be graded by the NBA, they're more likely to not blow the whistle. So this is kind of an interesting result. Means that they are indeed changing their behavior because of this policy. And as a robustness check, we see if this is also occurring in the third quarter. It would be strange if it happened in the third quarter because they're not being observed then, or they're not being publicly graded then, and we find no effect. Here's a visual for this sort of, for these outcomes. We have pre-L2M close games and then post-L2M close games, and we find that the red bars seem to be slightly shifted to the left relative to the blue bars, meaning that these high frequency whistle games, these 5 whistle games, are much less frequent than in the post period relative to the pre period. So we do see this slight reduction in the average. The next thing we're going to look at is correctness streaks. So if the last call was correct or incorrect, what's the probability of this next call being correct or incorrect? If you were correct the last call you made, the next call you make has about a 7.7% of probability of being incorrect. And if you were incorrect last time, the probability of being incorrect at this time is 10%. And that's a significant difference just doing a simple z-test of proportions, about 3% difference. So we also do this in a regression framework. We find that if the previous call was incorrect, there's about a 6% increase in the probability of the next call being incorrect. However, this effect is mitigated when referees have more rest. So this is kind of a very similar result as we were finding originally, where it seems like fatigue is reducing, or fatigue is reducing correctness, or rest is increasing correctness. We also look at their correctness percentage in their previous L2M reports, and we find a negative effect. But once we control for referee fixed effects, that effect seems to disappear. And then finally, we look at whether they've been shown in that there's an overturn ruling or a support ruling in the previous play. Pretty much, hey, you're doing a good job. We support this decision, or hey, you guys got it wrong last time, and we find no effect for either of these. It really just seems to be this streakiness and correctness, which we need to explore more. And then this fatigue measurement is going to mitigate that effect. So that's all I have for today. I appreciate all the questions and comments. I'm hoping for some more. If you guys have any, I'm happy to talk about it. But I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll turn on my camera.
Thank you very much, Alex. We've got another Alex with his hand up, Alex Krumer.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's very interesting. I would like to know a bit about this committee that decides whether this is correct or not, because I'm not sure how exactly, who decides what is correct, what is not. How many people are there? Is it like, if it's 7 people, 4-3, is it still correct or not correct? How does it work?
That's a great question. So it seems black boxy, honestly, where it seems like there's another referee crew or a group. I know they have a replay center that I'm sure that they're looking through, but they just say, I guess I have to share my screen again, so I won't. But there is a little bit of a description of what these L2M reports are, and it just essentially says the NBA has decided these are correct and incorrect. I'm equally skeptical as you are, because analyzing these data, I'm noticing that there are more and more correct no calls over time, which just seems like a really, really easy way to inflate the probability of, or the percent correct, right? If some guy is dribbling and some guy's defending him, then the NBA can very easily say, hey, he didn't foul him there. Like, that's correct. And they can do that for every single second of every game if they were being so malicious. But so I'm a little skeptical on that sort of thing, but I don't have an idea about the committee or anything like this.
Because the other thing is that in your paper that you presented, you found that those mistakes are somewhat, they may affect the probability of winning of the away team in a way, right? And then there is domestic violence, like implicitly. So
I don't think I'm saying that
no, you didn't say it. You didn't say it, but you have more domestic violence when a home team loses unexpectedly, or there is an upset, right? and then you find that there are more mistakes. It is likely that there are more mistakes in these matches in favor of the away team. Is that correct?
Okay. I see where you're going with that. I think that would have to be the mechanism. We don't test that explicitly, but that is a good thought that we can test.
And in that regard, it would be very interesting, also important to understand how exactly they evaluate these calls, correct or not correct. If it's with voice of the audience, the decision of whether this is correct or not would be, I think it would be different than if they do it silently. There are several papers that show it. So that's very important to understand.
No, thank you. That's a good point. I'm definitely going to think about that more.
Thanks, Alex. Question I had actually, Alex, which may be obvious, but do the referees know that the game was qualified for the last 2-minute report? Is there some kind of signal given to them? Because you mentioned some cases where 2 minutes or one left and something happens. Is there any kind of knowledge that they know for sure? And could you look at those games where they're not totally sure whether they are being graded or not and see if they're different in their nature?
That's a good question. I don't think the NBA signals to them in any way. I think it's probably not binary. It's probably not like we are being observed and we need to be careful, and we are not being observed and we don't need to be careful, because the NBA is still grading them, but internally. I think they just know that, hey, when the game is really close, we're going to be publicly evaluated, and the typically internal reports are now going to be for public eyes. So I think that's generally more of the sense, that it's not this like at exactly 3 minutes or 3 points versus 4 points, this effect is happening. It's probably more like it's just more concentrated then, but it is probably a general upward slope, because if it's within 4 points, it could be within 3 points in just the next shot. So they're probably being careful more generally when it's close relative to when it's not close.
Yeah. And also another kind of follow-up question is, are you able to look at player behavior in any kind of meaningful way? I mean, is it possible that players behave a bit differently given they know that the referees are under a bit more scrutiny?
That is also something that we're going to look at. I just didn't put it here because so we have this really cool data in basketball arenas. They have these cameras, and the technology is called Sport VU. The NBA used to release it for every single game, but they've since stopped. I think it was just too much data and they didn't want the public to have it. But essentially what it was is every second, the camera would take a picture of the court like 10 times. So we essentially have like less than second level tracking data on the ball and the 10 players. So one thing that we were thinking of is looking at an event study of player movement or player speed, in which we would be saying this is a proxy for effort, given the call was correctly made or incorrectly made, and see if players are going to be maybe more aggressive or less aggressive after this, or if generally movement is going to be different in these time periods. Because it definitely could be the case that it's a two-sided game. It's like, cops and robbers almost. If the cops are being watched, the robbers can be more aggressive because the cops are going to have to face more scrutiny. So that's a good point, and we've thought about it a little bit, just not 100% yet because the data are so big and it's a little difficult to work with.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Alex. Any more questions and comments?
Just another one in that regard. Is there maybe it's crazy, but is there any chance that referees, let's say they see that there is 4 points gap, and they can be evaluated only from 3 points? Is there any chance they kind of influence the game, that it's not, so they have kind of strategic behavior there?
Yeah, so I actually had this
I know it's crazy, but
I actually had this point on my slides like 2 days ago. And okay. I was investigating it a little bit. I was using original point spreads and then where the game was at with 5 minutes left in the fourth quarter, and what if it actually ended up qualifying for an L2M report, and I really found no effects. Now, I think the reason for that is because the referees would be in so much trouble for point shaving if that was the case. But yeah, I mean, to me, the incentives would be, let me keep this game away from that threshold.
No, but I think this result by itself is a nice result. We don't only have to report negative things. That's also a nice result. They behave okay. They are okay.
Yeah, so it seems like they're not point shaving, if that's anyone's wondering.
But then it's more difficult to prove that there is no effect rather than there is an effect. So,
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for that question.
Thanks, Alex. Any more questions and comments? Okay, well, I think that means there isn't. There's plenty of discussion along the way there, so thank you very much, Alex, for a really interesting talk. Again, for the non-experts out here, it was really engaging and really interesting, really good work, and look forward to the follow-up. Obviously, congratulations on the publication already bagged. So thank you, everyone, also for attending. We will now have a 2-week break. Next week is the ESCA conference in Helsinki, at which a number of folk will be there. Unfortunately, I can't be there, but I will be on holiday instead, which is a consolation prize. It does mean there are 2 weeks without a Roses Talk now. We're going to return on September the 9th when it's Rasmus Storm presenting on an as yet to be confirmed title, but you can find more information. I will circulate more information near the time, and there'll be information on Twitter as well. So a couple of weeks off. Enjoy Helsinki if you're going there. And I look forward to seeing you all online again in a few weeks' time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.